Bob Hall, and I've been a comic book artist and a theater director all my life, and was born here. Went to the University of Nebraska, got an MA in theater, moved to New York, found a day job I was trying to break in as a director, and gravitated toward drawing comics because I'd always drawn, and it was storytelling, and I found I was able to get work there. And so I worked for Marvel for 15 years while also doing theater. Then moved to a company called Valiant, where I both wrote and drew a character called Shadow Man and something called Dark and Dangerous. And then I did Batman work, and then the comics business fell apart for a few years because a big collector market went to hell. And I had founded the Shakespeare Festival. I had come back here because I had found out I was adopted and wanted to find out something. I have been living here now since 1998. That's my story.
Okay. It's Richard.
I'm Richard Graham. I was not born here. I'm an Army brat. My family moved here in the early 80s, where I graduated from Nebraska City High School. I attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where I met my future wife. Went on to graduate school at the University of Iowa, then down at Texas A&M Corpus Christi, before coming back here as a faculty member, where I am now a professor at the university libraries. And I hold a courtesy appointment in the English department, and I'm currently co-teaching a history class. I like to use comics and graphic novels in the classroom, and invite this guy into it as often as I can.
What you are is what goes into your writing. It's just inevitable. Even if you're doing total fantasy stuff, it works better if instead of basing it on previous stories that you've read, if you base it on something from your reality. So, of course, Nebraska has influenced it. I've also worked Nebraska into any number of things that I did whenever I get a chance, because I can be more specific about it. I can talk about it. So I've set things in the Sandhills. I've set things at Carhenge. I've used the zoo bar. I had a magical character end up his career in Lincoln, and with the Capitol Building and Morrill Hall featured. And at one point doing the Avengers, Jim Shooter asked me, set this someplace other than in New York City that you know about. So the Avengers eventually confront somebody by landing their jet in the middle of Interstate 80. So things like that. But of course, the more, I would say, profound or deeper influence is just all the people I've known that I've met here. I remember once a guy came up with, I was sitting and drawing in a coffee shop, and a guy came up and said, quite an eccentric character, who said, what would you be saying if I was to tell you that I could slip slide through time? And I said, well, I'd want to know more about that. He said, okay, listen to this. I go to the bathroom, and then I come back before I left and find out what you were saying about me while I was gone. Now, that makes no sense, but it was great dialogue in a comic book.
It's actually quite extensive, and it's almost surprising, or more than you would think. There's quite a few people in addition to Bob that Nebraska should be proud of, or that we could claim as our own. For example, the very first woman comic strip artist that we can document, or that we can go back to, is in the 1890s, and that was Rose O'Neal, the creator of the Cupid doll. And while she was born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, her formative years were in Nebraska, specifically in Omaha, around the Creighton University area, where she honed her craft in this sort of large Catholic Irish family, and became a very well-renowned artist. In fact, she won an Omaha World Herald contest when she was 14, and famously had to prove to the editors that she didn't plagiarize it. And she goes on, when she's 18, she goes to New York, where she later becomes the first female illustrator on Puck magazine, where her contemporaries and colleagues are people like Charles Dana Gibson of the Gibson Girls and James Montgomery Flagg. And so Rose O'Neal is the first credited woman comic strip artist, owes a lot of that to Nebraska. She famously later moved to Missouri with her family, and she also ended up having a strong friendship with another Nebraskan who liked Missouri, John Neihart, where he would talk to her and visit her about her poetry and stuff. You have some wonderful exhibits here, but some of the highlights include people like Claire Briggs. And in fact, Lincoln High here in Nebraska has like a trifecta of comic book artists or comic artists that they can boast, starting with Claire Briggs in the 1890s, who studies famously under General Pershing at UNL, then goes to St. Louis and then New York, where he becomes an incredibly popular comic strip artist and sports illustrator. Then Oz Black was a Lincoln High graduate who goes into UNL, and he became the Lincoln Star and Lincoln Journal editorial cartoonist before moving to Minneapolis and then Denver and working there. And he was a wonderful regional artist, and his materials are held here at the Heritage Room as well as in the State Historical Society. And they're wonderful to look at because they really depict the regionalism of Lincoln and the Nebraska area, and you'll see names and people and all kinds of funny coincidences, such as the Big Ten courting Nebraska in 1911. But nonetheless, after Oz Black, we can fast forward to the 1950s and 60s, where Lincoln High School graduate Steve Wilson, or S. Clay Wilson, attends the University of Nebraska, then goes to Lawrence, Kansas, where he's with the publisher Plamel, who is sort of a beatnik and helps publish Zap Comics. Wilson goes to the West Coast, where he meets up with Robert Crumb. Robert Crumb, a very famous underground comics artist, who credits Wilson for liberating him in terms of sexuality and not being afraid to draw a nude figure or two. And so Wilson goes on to illustrate numerous other people. Work, including Ken Kesey, Charles Bukowski, and the list goes on and on. We've had recently Caitlin Cass, a UNO creative writing professor, just won the Eisner Award for their work, and a UNL graduate, Van Jensen, his work Pinocchio, and again, a lot of this speaks to the fact that we wouldn't necessarily know some of this because oftentimes you would have to leave Nebraska to publish. And maybe what they would carry with them, as Bob had indicated, are names and people and places and characters and instances, but also maybe characteristics of, shame or guilt or loyalty or whatever it is that sort of defines us here, that kind of allows you to persevere in what can be a very hard-working industry that you have to really strive to be recognized and make a living. So Nebraska's influence is far and wide.
Well, the most significant is John Buscema, who was one of Marvel's key illustrators. And he and Stan Lee wanted John to get together with him to write a book on how to draw comics, which became, you can still buy it, it's called How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. John he never went to art school. He had learned, as a lot of cartoonists did. In fact, there was almost, at one time, cartoonists were proud of the fact that they didn't go to art school, that they did develop their own style, etc. And so John said, well, if I'm going to write this book, I have to teach a class, because I'll have to work through what you have to do. So we did, and there was a little ad in the back of Marvel Comics, just as I was trying to break into the business, that said, show up with your portfolio at this hotel, and go to this conference room, and I got in the class, and it was a great class. It was remarkable to take a class from somebody who was one of probably, let's say, the 10 best artists going at what he did. Very, very different feel than I was used to. Not that I hadn't had wonderful professors, but that was unique. And at the end of the class, John got me the job at Marvel. So he was the major influence. But when I broke in, it was the 1970s, and there was a renaissance of comic book art. So I immediately looked at all of these people, and I with names that people may or may not know: Bernie Wrightson, Barry Windsor Smith, Neil Adams, just amazing people. And I thought, oh, well, I'm not good enough to do this, but I want to be, because they inspired me. They were so, what was happening was not like the comics I remembered as a kid. They were just really great. Other things that were really influential on me were films, all of Orson Welles' films, any noir film, and the Hammer horror films. A lot of my pacing in comics are based on a love I had when I was 18 for those films, which now seem a little bit corny to me, but then comic books often seem a little corny to me now. But they were not the moody Universal films. They were things that had a pace like this, and I always wanted that feeling when I was doing the superhero stuff. Part of it was my family. My family were not super educated people, but they encouraged me, and encouragement is everything. I had always liked stories, and anything that I've done has been in terms of telling stories, and then at some point I began to feel that I could maybe write as well. I was at first more comfortable drawing than I was writing, until I wrote a couple of plays. And from there I went on to write comics. But my father had a brother who was in show business, who I never met. He lived in California, which was a magical place for us. It was a mythical place in my family. We were always going to go there someday, and we never did. So he was this mythical person out there doing his thing. And I thought as a kid, well, of course, like most kids, I wanted to get out of the basement, which was my domain, and go elsewhere. And I always thought, I'll go to California and become a writer and meet my uncle. Never did, but I went to New York and eventually ended up writing things. Under a deadline. That's everything to me. I find that even if I start trying to work on something, I throw a lot of it away. It's all preparation work, but the real work gets done when I'm under the gun. And then stuff starts to emerge that I didn't really know was there because I don't have time to think about it. And in the case of my writing, obviously you need a lot of preparation. You have to think what you're doing. You work at it. But the best stuff seems to me, with the drawing as well, comes out. My favorite drawing is the underdrawing, where it's gestural. And I think my writing is gestural as well. It's something that finally occurs to me on the spot. No matter how much I try, the stuff that I write earlier, most of it gets rewritten eventually. If you have kids, I think there's a company called Gladstone that republished a lot of Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck comics by Carl Barks. Carl Barks was a true genius, and I didn't realize, I loved him when I was a kid. Beautifully drawn, and they have these adventures. I didn't realize how good he was till a few years ago. I managed to buy a whole stack of reprints of his stuff and started reading them, and eventually read through all of them because he was writing stuff that worked on a level for adults as well as for children. And I think that's a missing ingredient in a lot of children's. We're so specific about, this is for a 12-year-old, this is for, and he obviously didn't think that way. And so I would say for that, I of course would tell people, look at The Watchmen. That's the superhero. And if you like superheroes, then that's the one that deconstructs the superheroes. If you like just general stories, buy some of Will Eisner's early graphic novels. I'm particularly fond of his first one, A Contract with God, a bunch of short stories, and one later about the Protocols of Zion, which is a hell of an important piece and a really good one. Beyond that, I would say find a comic book store. There's one in Omaha. I don't think there's one in Lincoln that has a coffee house attached to it where you can sit with a whole bunch of them and just look through them. Because now the wonderful thing about graphic novels is comic books don't all look like Marvel or DC anymore. There's all of this variety and wonderful stuff, and you can look at it, and it's picking them out is interesting because I'll pick out something that somebody said, this is a great story, and I'll look at it and I don't like the art, and I'll put it back on the shelf. Or I'll pull out one and I say, I've never seen anything like this, and that's fun. Or just somebody will do something, and I have no idea why, but it'll just, I want to read this. And I think if you take the time, that used to be, see, it's still the spinner rack mentality. You want to go in, you want to flip through the darn things, and then put the ones back, and then pick out the one that you really want to take home.
Younger adults respond really strongly to people like Raina Telgemeier, who's done Guts and Babysitter's Club and drama, which speaks to middle schoolers. If you're into true crime or journalism, in addition to having history students read Will Eisner's Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Durf Back Durf's Four Dead in Ohio, which is about the killings of the Kent State students in 1970, which applies comics journalism. So there are footnotes, there's interviews, there's primary and secondary sources. I often have students, one of the for their introduction to superheroes is, again, a comic that Bob had worked on called Squadron Supreme, because it's Marvel's analog to DC. So there's some of the familiarity of these archetypes and tropes, but they're explored in a way that I think makes you sort of confront another stage of your development in terms of, again, devising a code of ethics or thinking about things morally. Clearly now is the time that we remove the stigma of them being for children, or that you're not doing any sort of deep or authentic reading while you read comics. And I would, as Bob had said, encourage you to seek out and try different kinds and see what art styles speak to you and what stories or genres really match your interests.
Consider if you really want to do it. Do you really want to stay up till 3 in the morning churning these things out? Do you really want to meet these kind of deadlines? Do you want to be severely underpaid? Do you want to be writing on speculation? And the reason I would be that discouraging is if you can say, I don't care, I still want to do it, then do it. It is a tough business. And I think the key thing is that you must want to go ahead. If you do start and you do finish it, and if you complete it, even if your first one isn't exactly what you'd wanted, and you go on to the next one, I would say yes, then you belong in the business, and you can do it, because you're going to have to really work at it. As an artist and as a writer, I would say the other thing is it's a totally different business than when I went into it, and you must diversify. Be able to, as an artist, be able to work in comics, be able to do album covers, CD covers, gaming, storyboards. In my day, when you got the job with Marvel, you probably could work there for 20 years. Now you may have one story arc, it may be very successful, and then you won't get called for another one for 2 years or something. It's much more like being an actor, of all things. So just be aware of that when you're getting into it. And don't let anybody discourage you, as I just tried to. If you can get discouraged that easily, maybe you don't belong in it. But if you're saying, well, I don't care, I want to do it, I'm going to do this, then great.
Well, was it Jack Kirby who said that comics will break your heart, kid? Yeah, I think exactly as Bob said, it requires a lot of diligence, a lot of perseverance. There's a comics creator in Portland who recently passed, and the Comics Journal, I think, in the obituary, they're sort of lamenting but there's so many unsung artists and unrecognized artists that are toiling away, and that it takes a bit of good luck, be able to do self-promotion. But for a lot of people, it's an art and it's a way of expressing themselves. And It's certainly, you know, you don't eschew it so you can be a novelist or things like that. I think it's a medium worth investigating and honing your craft in.
And it's also a relatively new, although it's been around for 100 years now, that's still relatively new in the greater scheme of things, and so it's a chance where you can invent. And one of the best things I think about graphic novels is that you can do that. The big two, Marvel and DC, have become more and more trademarked characters, and the difficulty with it's a thrill to do Captain America the first time you do it, and then you realize that character can't die, even though they've tried to kill him, but they can't. He keeps coming back slowly. He will come back to the same guy with wearing his underwear on the outside. He can't really grow. He's always going to be Superman. He's always going to be Captain America. In a graphic novel, you can do anything you want to. And that's really important to developing your work, actually. And people who did that coming into comics were some of the great creators when it was really a raw, new business and hadn't become corporate. They would bring what they did to it, and you would say, wow, I never expected it to look like that. Now it has a little tendency to look the same. But that's maybe because I'm old and I liked it back when I started. I've got about 3 projects on the string. 2 of them are on hold because a friend of mine who is in film, and I can't over talk about this, his agent was approached by somebody who wanted to say, can you make a play out of one of your novels? And he called me and said, I'm too close to the material. Would you want to collaborate with me and to deconstruct my novel into a play? And so I'm trying to do that now, and we'll see what comes of it. Beyond that, I've got 2 things that I'm working on, neither of which I will talk about because they're unfinished yet. But they're both would be, one would be a crime novel and one would be about the comics industry.
I just finished digitizing the Osblex collections that are here in the Historical Society. A lot of my work right now is in the curriculum and library instruction field. However, I would love to finally put a bow on this Rose O'Neill project, where I've done quite a bit of research on her life and collected the whole run of her comics that I think would make an excellent publication, as there's this now renewed interest in this sort of kawaii or these cute characters, but also because it's in the public domain. Because that's probably one of the #1 issues that comes up in comics historianship, or wanting to do reprints, which are, of course, wanting to pay the rights holders their due fees. So.
And a woman named Judy Diamond, who you know, and she called me to see if I would like to do a graphic novel about the measles, and I said, I don't think so. And she said, why? And I said, well, because I remembered a lot of the educational comics from when I was a kid were deadly dull. And so she said, no, we want you to write it as well and to make it as much like a Marvel comic as you can. And so I did, and did something called the Carnival of Contagion, which you can still see online or get from University Press. And so we did. And I had a lot of fun doing it. They assigned me a scientist to keep me on track, and we went on to do one about mosquitoes. And eventually, during COVID, we did a weekly comic page for kids. All of this through the National Science Foundation, which I hope will still keep doing that kind of work. Those were eventually assembled into a graphic novel as well.
I'm a big fan of that work as well. I have a massive collection and an interest in it, in fact, because of the Army manuals that I was first exposed to. But, you know, believe it or not, yeah, comics are an incredible medium to affect change and cause a change in behavior. As Bob has so well done in terms of simplifying certain concepts, or making something that would be described in a text way, making it visually accessible, creates better understanding. yeah, I mean, it's made an impact, so I don't think it would be too hyperbolic to say that Bob has helped save lives with his comic art.
Ooh, thank you.
I mean, at the very least,
that makes me
this
feel really
Midwestern
good.
kid, 12 years old, buying a comic book off a spinner rack in Little Nebraska City. Certainly, Bob's work is, at the very least, if not with his scientific illustration and humanitarian drive, even in his storytelling, has provided outlets and worlds for imagination and stuff. And so I'm always grateful, forever grateful for Bob for that.
Well, hello. Welcome to the John H. Ames reading series at the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors at Bennett Martin Public Library. I'm Deb Arns, the curator of Heritage Room. And for those not familiar with us, our mission is to preserve and celebrate works by and about Nebraska authors. We're supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association and the Foundation for Lincoln City Libraries. We're grateful for their help, which makes events like these possible. The Ames Reading Series gives Nebraska authors the opportunity to share their work with the community, and this is the 231st program since its beginning in 1985. And you can actually see a lot of them on YouTube if you want to go back a few years. This program is being filmed and will be available on the Lincoln City Library's YouTube channel, along with an interview that our authors completed I conducted with them earlier today. So a little more information there. Today, we are delighted to host Bob Hall and Richard Graham. Lincoln native Bob Hall is a theater director, playwright, and acclaimed comic book artist. A graduate of Lincoln High School and the University of Nebraska, he moved to New York in the 1970s, directing theater and illustrating for Marvel Comics on titles such as The Avengers, Spider-Man, and Doctor Strange, and co-creating West Coast Avengers and Squadron Supreme. He later worked for Valiant and DC Comics, producing notable works like Shadow Man, I, Joker, and Batman DOA. Hall has directed over 100 plays, co-founded the Flatwater Shakespeare Festival, and served as artistic director of the Nebraska Repertory Theater. His recent projects include educational comics for UNL, and the COVID-era Corona Comics. His honors include the Governor's Arts Award, 2 Lincoln Mayor's Arts Awards, and UNL's Distinguished Alum Award. It was a lot, Bob. Very distinguished guy. Richard Graham is professor of libraries and chair of the teaching partnerships at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Libraries. He holds a courtesy appointment with the English department, where he teaches a comics as literature course and co-teaches a history course that uses graphic novels as both primary and secondary sources. His research interests include using comics as instructional methods or tools, and comic artists and narratives from and about the Great Plains. His book, Government Issue, Comics for the People, was nominated for an Eisner Award in 2012, and he served as an Eisner Award judge in 2015. He is currently the managing editor of SANE, Sequential Art Narratives and Education, an open access peer-reviewed journal focusing on comics in the classroom. So please welcome Bob and Richard.
You first?
All right, I'll go first. Again, I'm Richard Graham. I'm a librarian. I write about comics. I consume comics. My wife creates comics. There are people here in the audience who, with quite a pedigree and an amount of prestige, that have also created comics. So this could be an interesting conversation. But I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to be able to offer an opportunity of what it's like to be a comics historian or someone who studies comics as literature. I will say that, like many people of my generation and my age, that comics were my building blocks of literacy, that they gave me the confidence and the vocabulary to grow and to build upon and to be able to read more and more things. I've had a somewhat unique experience in introduction to comics in that my very first comic book was actually an Army manual, which later turned out to be something called P.S. Monthly, which was originated by the great Will Eisner, though not drawn by him at that time. I was an Army brat, moved around a lot. My mom's German, and so her version of comics were Bande Dessinée or BD, the Franco-Belgian tradition of Smurfs, Asterix, and Obelix, and Tintin. But when we moved to Nebraska City, when my dad retired, I had this sort of nostalgic opportunity of visiting the corner drugstore with the spinner rack where I could buy my superhero titles, most notably Bob Hall's West Coast Avengers limited edition series I remember buying at that time from there. But as I said, comics have grown with me, and my interest in them as a scholar has especially strengthened because they're multidisciplinary. We grow up in a visual culture, though we're never explicitly taught visual literacy. It's something that we pick up as we go along. Because of that introduction to comics in the form of an Army manual, I'm very interested in using comic books to teach. And so it was very pleasing for me to return to Bob's work when he began his artistry and his collaboration with Dr. Judy Diamond on the COVID comics that came out of UNL after they were awarded a SEPA, $5 million SEPA grant. So I still regularly consume comics. My children do. I buy them for the library, and I teach them in my classes.
I got started in comics. My folks bought me comics when I was young, and when I was quite young. And they were all the comics that were sort of good for a kid. The Warner Brothers kind of Porky Pig and Bugs Bunny and that kind of stuff. But I managed when I was at 4 years old to get very sick. I was vomiting blood, and my folks, of course, were petrified and took me off to the emergency room. And fortunately, they put me in a private room. And the next day, I felt fine, but they did all the tests and things that they do and said, no, you're not fine. There's something wrong. Or they were telling my folks then on the assumption that I couldn't hear, although they were standing right there saying these things. And they kept trying to pacify me, and they found eventually that the thing that would pacify me the most was if they would bring me comic books. Now, I couldn't really read all that well yet, but the fact that you could visually, with the best ones, not all of them, but with the best ones, you could tell the story from the pictures. That remained with me as a key to what comics can do. A couple of days later, the stack had grown, and they had no editing at all as to what they gave me. There were EC comics, horror comics, crime comics, anything that would just keep me from jumping up and down on the bed. And they were going to take me in for some more tests, and she said, "No, these tests they're making them sound like this one was going to be awful." And just before they went, they noticed me doing this, and the nurse came and looked behind my ear and said, "Oh, I got to go get the doctor." And she went and got to the doctor. The doctor came back and looked behind my ear, and he started to laugh, and he said, "You've got measles." And he said, what you had, it became instantly clear to me. He said, what you had was intestinal measles, very rare, but they're not dangerous. It just feels like something's wrong inside, and we can't pinpoint it. But you've obviously gone, since it's measles, it has a certain arc to it, and you're past the arc of danger, so you can go home now. And it's the most contagious disease known. So all those comics, you have to take those home. And so I had those to go by when the next year in first grade I actually learned to read. And that's where I started, was with that idea that it's pictures, and then later pictures plus words. And it was that combination. And that's remained with me, the feeling that the best comics are visual, and that they're kind of visual first. Otherwise, why the heck are you doing all the pictures? And then the writing can be counterpoint to those pictures. It doesn't have to be redundancy. If you're really able to make it all clear from the picture. Now, you can't make it all clear from the pictures, but you can get a pretty good idea. It's like watching a movie with the sound turned off, which is an interesting thing to do if you've never done it. So that's where I started. And then I was very influenced by horror movies. I loved horror movies because my folks wouldn't let me watch them. And finally, at age 14, they decided I was old enough, and it was a special year in the history of comics because it just coincided with me being that age. It was 1958, and Universal International, that was the year that they released all of their old horror movies to television. And it was the year that Hammer Films started remaking Dracula and Frankenstein and all those movies. And a magazine came out called Famous Monsters of Filmland that had brilliant covers by a man named Basil Gagos. And I wanted to be Basil Gagos. I wanted to be able to do that. So my art at the time at 18 was learning to do portraits that sort of were as good as his, which they weren't, but that's what got me started. But then I later developed an interest in the theater because I was an only child. I later found out I was adopted only child, and so I was kind of, we know there are kids around, so I was one of those kids. I sat doing stuff in my basement, and all of a sudden I found that I was okay doing theater, and that I suddenly had a community. And so that's what I studied in college, and I directed a bunch of plays, and I found out I had a knack for directing. That's important because directing is essentially storytelling. And I went to New York to try to, when I graduated, after I got a master's degree, and trying to break into the theater. And I needed a flexible day job, and somebody suggested, why don't you look at comics? And he said, you've always drawn, and you can tell a story. And I remembered comics from these stack of comics, and some of those were really well drawn, and some of them were really miserable. And I thought, well, I can be bad. I can do that. And then he gave me a stack to look at. Well, it was a Renaissance time in comics, 1970. And there were superb people, names that some of you may or may not know, but people like Neil Adams, John Buscema, Bernie Wrightson, Barry Windsor Smith, Joe Kubert. They were all doing and of course Jack Kirby. They were always all doing their best work ever. And I looked at it and said, well, I'm not good enough to do this, but I really wanted to because it combined everything I'd already loved into one package. And so I started putting a portfolio together. In the meantime, I was directing plays in New York. I was able to do that. And but I still needed that day job because the pay was miserable. In theater, the pay in theater was even worse than the pay in comics. So I was getting a little bit of work from something called Charlton, which was the butt end of the comics business, but a lot of us started there. And eventually, there's a lot of people who love the old Charlton comics, and I do too. But Marvel, at Marvel, Stan Lee wanted John Buscema to collaborate with him on a book about how to draw comics. And it became a book called How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. But John said, I've never had any formal training. Everything was an apprenticeship or working in a studio. That's how he learned. He said, to write the book, I'd have to teach a class. And so there was a little ad in the back of Marvel Comics because they underwrote him to teach a class that you can sign up for this class. And so I signed up for the class. And he taught it for 9 months being taught by probably one of the 5 or 10 best comic artists in the world, was remarkable. And at the end of the class, John got me the job at Marvel. So I've spent the rest of my career alternating between doing comic books and doing theater. And that's the story of my life. There.
I mean, right now we're very lucky. We've got Scott Stewart here, a Lincoln, Nebraska native, who also self-published underground comics here in the 70s, which is a reflection of that time in visual storytelling, where in order to rebuke the two DC Marvel and not wanting to tell superhero stories, but people wanting to tell personal slice of life stories without a commercial editorial process. And Scott's here, and he's reflective of that. We have Paul Fell, who, while I wasn't born here, came to Nebraska and made this place his home. and has stayed here and has had a wide impact on not only his local editorial cartoons about local issues, but national issues as well. And I didn't ask for permission, Paul, but as I had mentioned earlier, when I talk to people about Paul, I show one of his more notorious claims to fame, which was in the 2000s when there was this real worrisome of conflict of interest between journalists and their political leaning or memberships and their reporting, and Paul was brought out on that. And rather unfairly, but Paul famously told him to kiss his ass, and it kind of gave Nebraska, a Nebraska editorial cartoonist, some folklore, a little bit of mythology behind that, and speaking out against, which is something that we're all very familiar with now in terms of people following you about what you do in your private life and how that may or may not interfere with your social life. And of course, Bob here, having worked not only at DC and Marvel, but having been a Marvel editor for a short time, and we were talking about his friendship with a very prominent Marvel editor, Jim Shooter, who then later on ran Valiant, that Bob was part of, and Bob being part of the creation of superhero teams and a graphic novel that I teach called Squadron Supreme. Beyond that, so Rose O'Neill, the creator of the Cupid doll, got her start at the Omaha World Herald. She's the first woman comic strip artist. She published something called The Old Subscriber Looks On in Look magazine. She's the first woman comic strip artist. Claire Briggs, there's people behind us here that have had a significant impact, but Claire Briggs moving to, after attending Lincoln High and UNL, going to St. Louis and then New York, and having one heck of a career as a sports illustrator and as a comic strip artist himself. It goes on and on and on. Chris Ware was born in Omaha, attended Brownell Talbot, though he left for Austin, Texas, and then and lives in Chicago. Caitlin Cass, a UNO professor, just won the Eisner Award for her book on suffragettes. Bob's favorite comic book store in Omaha won an Eisner Award for being a comic book store. Legends. Legends did. Scott, Paul Norris had a brief time in Nebraska. He's a co-creator of Aquaman. J. Allen Klein, Rex Maxon. You're a fan of Tarzan. Rex Maxon worked on that as well. We have Van Jensen, a UNL alum, a Western Nebraska person who did Pinocchio Vampire Slayer as a sort of self-published, and then worked on and on as well as for DC. Rainbow Rowell, who I used to read her stories in the Daily Nebraskan. No comment on that. Surprised, but wonderfully surprised at her success in writing comics as well. So, again, from Alpha to today, Nebraskans have had a presence. And even just in the periphery, I don't want to ignore S. Clay Wilson and his impact through the Zap Collective, also another, like Bob and like Claire Briggs and like Oz Black here, a Lincoln High graduate, but S. Clay Wilson being part of the Zap Collective. Robert Crumb famously crediting Wilson for liberating him and encouraging to push further in terms of nudity and whatnot. And then I have to mention Bob Bierbaum, who had recently passed. And while he himself was not a comics artist, he was a UNL alum from Fremont, who was an early collector and was part of the very early part of trading and collecting, and he ultimately opened a comic book store on the West Coast. But he had an impact on comic book history because he was one of the first people to bring out this book called, by Obadiah Oldbuck, The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, which is what we would call a platinum era, but a very early example of a graphic novel. And so that was a Nebraskan, a UNL alum, a successful comic book store owner, who was able to contribute to the history of this visual storytelling medium. And Bob came back and moved back to Fremont, and I got to meet and talk with him too. And so, Bob had kind of hinted at, like, there's this sort of invisible thing about being a Nebraskan. And when I attended Peru State College, I had a professor there, and we would always joke that there's no place like Nebraska, except for parts of Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, South Dakota. And boundaries are sort of imaginary, right? But when we talk about cinnamon rolls and chili, right, or when we talk about how when we're in our family gatherings, we put our hands in our lap and say, well, right, I think that there are some things about growing up here that sort of stick with us. First of all, there's these characters that we grow up with, that Bob was able to kind of incorporate into his work, and that S. Clay Wilson was able to as well. That people like Jim Thompson, the author Jim Thompson, comes to mind when he would write his early noir stuff, that he had people in Nebraska that he often thought of. So that we're home to some eccentric characters that stick with us. But I think there's something about living here that requires diligence. I think that requires some flexibility, that there's also a hunger. I think one of the things that I realize when people find out you're from Nebraska, it's this annoying as hell thing, but they often think you know everybody. And then, of course, it turns out you do, right? But I think it puts a chip on our shoulder because, again, something that about being published, whether it was going to be a comics artist or a filmmaker or a poet, is that you often had to leave here. And you had to make your way in places like New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, places where there were publishing houses. And, competition is hard, and I think it took anything that you had with you growing up in a place like Nebraska or in the Great Plains that could help you see you through. And Bob has often described comics especially as being an unforgiving art or an unforgiving industry to operate under. And so I like to think that that part of the Great Plains that allows people like Rose O'Neill or Bob or Paul or Scott, or even Caitlin Cass, who had moved here, is just like someone just being in this geographic location where we kind of know each other's business. Things are a little bit more personal because we're a little bit closer to one another. So, yeah, you don't have to leave Nebraska anymore, fortunately. People like Paul and Scott and Bob came back and are still here, and they're still cranking out work. And so, yeah, it's a good place to be a visual storyteller.
And that Nebraskans learn to create because nobody's creating for you. You kind of have to develop that ability to make some things happen. And I think that's one of the joys of being here and having experienced, for instance, both New York and Nebraska. The difference, I think, is that people are very tuned into the idea that you're making something happen here. Your audience may not be as huge, but people really appreciate that that's happening here. Whereas in New York, you're just one of a mob of people who are doing that. So I think that's very accurate. There are a few other people too that I remember. You remember Gris Grimley? Mm. He does horror illustration. Look him up sometime. Website. He's been very successful in now working with doing work in film, but he's published various books. Michael Golden, who was a fine comic artist, was born on the border. He's half Wyoming and half Nebraska. He's from a ranch that is split in two. And I'll have to ask you, there was a guy, he took over briefly from Moon Knight after Bill Sienkiewicz needed a break. And he's become very well known, and I've been trying to think of his name because he's also lives in Nebraska, closer to the Kansas border, but I'll have to find his name.
Yeah.
We'll have to put him on the list. The internet has changed everything. It really started with fax and FedEx. That meant you could be anywhere, get your work to the companies overnight, or in my case, I lived in Europe for a while, in 2 days. And the fax allowed you to contact your editor almost instantly. and all of a sudden you were free. You didn't have to live in the New York area anymore.
Yeah. Stephen Bissett has funny stories of FedEx. Stephen Bissett, who drew Swamp Thing, living in rural Vermont, waiting for the FedEx man, to come and living or dying by deadline by, the ability to reach you rurally. But again, like you said, allowing you to not have to live there.
Two or three real quickly that are they're not necessarily my most favorite things to have done, but they were interesting projects. When I was being an editor at Marvel and in the office every day, John Belushi, who had just started doing Saturday Night Live, called up Jim Shooter, the editor at Marvel at the time, and said, "Gee, I'm a real Marvel fan. Would you mind if I came by the office and just tried to look around?" And Jim said, well, yeah, we'd probably like that a lot. And Belushi came up and knew what was going on. He was a big Marvel fan, it turns out, and he knew what was going on in every issue and blah, blah, blah. And on the way out, he said, you guys ought to do Spider-Man meets Saturday Night Live. And Jim, who was not one to let an opportunity pass, said, you think Lorne Michaels would go for that? And Jim said, I don't know, here's his number. And so called him the next day, and they said, fine. And so I was editing Team Up, which I was going to be in, and I said, no, I'm not going to let anybody draw this except me, because I'm going to get to go to 30 Rock and meet these people. And so we did, and it was great fun, and did get to meet them. And then when Animal House opened, Belushi invited us all to come to the opening night party for Animal House, and we took him the cover and gave him the cover. So that was a lot of fun. I've done a few things that way. Then years later, I did when I was doing Shadow Man, the CEO of Valiant, a guy named Steve Mazarsky, who had no business running a comic company whatsoever, had no idea how it worked, but he was a rock and roll lawyer, and he had been the lawyer for the group Aerosmith. And so he insisted that we do Shadow Man, my character at Valiant, do Shadow Man, who was supposed to have been a professional sax player before this strange thing happened for him. We want you to do Shadow Man meets Aerosmith. So I did Shadow Man meets Aerosmith, and I had to go to the concerts and wear earplugs, because they gave me front row, sitting in the mosh pit for this stuff, and went backstage and sort of met them. Their bass player, thank God, took pity on me and started telling me stories. The rest of them were wondering who the hell this guy was standing backstage. They were all a little nervous. Aerosmith had a big reputation for drugs, and so there was a lot of security keeping anybody that might be wanting to sell them drugs away from them. Did the comic, and then somebody got another call from Valiant and said, "We've arranged for you to do a signing with Aerosmith in Chicago." So I'm in Chicago, and here's this long table with all the members of Aerosmith and me. And then people coming in wondering, who the hell is the hairy guy sitting at the end of the table? Except for one person who I wish I'd got his name, because he only wanted my autograph. That was good. And then they had a bodyguard who was gigantic. He looked like, I don't know if you remember what Rosie Greer looked like, but he looked like Rosie Greer. And I would get up to go to the bathroom. He was not the brightest bulb in the chandelier. And I would come back and he would sort of pick me up and say, "Who are you? Where are you going?" "I'm the artist. Remember, I'm the artist." I was sitting and saying, "Oh, yeah." And he would put me down. This happened twice. And then after that, Steven Tyler, the front man for the group, said, he got bored, and he said, I think he gets bored very easily. And he said, I want to go to the Comic Con. I'm going to take a break and go to the con. And the security people said, "You can't do that. We're not set up for security." But they never quite got that far. They said, "You can't," and he was out the door. And they said to the rest of the group, they said, "You all got to go with him now. We got to keep you all together as a group and do security." And I thought, great, I just get to relax for a while. No, you're part of it. You have to go too. And so I start up the stairs, and there's Rosie Greer standing there saying, "Where are you going?" And I thought, I got it. And I had a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, I'm the artist. Remember, you're in the comic too, you know. "Yeah." And so all of a sudden I became part of the rock group. And he was bringing me Coca-Colas and everything, you know. So I had to call him up the next day and say, you got to send me the last page back because I got to put this guy in the comic or I'm going to be dead. So anyway, there.
Wow. You kind of give off these cop vibes, Bob. I can see why they were nervous.
The other thing that happened that was a Nebraska thing about that is we were asked, every cover of Team Up had a picture of Spider-Man and then who he was meeting in Team Up. But we couldn't quite find a good way to fit all of the characters from Saturday Night Live on the cover. And we didn't want to pick any one of them. We'd have gotten calls from everybody else's agent that was in it complaining. So my suggestion was, let's do the NBC symbol. And everybody agreed to that. And because they were all going to be on the cover, on the illustration, but we didn't want to put so many people on that the cover got clogged up. And at that time, the NBC symbol was an N. And we got calls from, some people know this story, we got calls from the lawyer who said, I need you to come over to the office, we're going to talk about that logo. Well, went to the office with Jim Shooter and my assistant and the writer, Chris Claremont. We were all sitting there and they said, now I want you to understand, you cannot do anything to that logo. Well, what do you mean? You cannot change it, you cannot stretch it, it has to be exactly what we sent to you. And we said, okay, that's what we plan to do. Now, and I'm not sure you understand. I want to make it very clear that that's what you have to do. Well, yeah, okay. He said, really? Now everybody's got that. And he was going on. And finally, again, a light bulb went off and I said, I understand, I'm from Nebraska. And he said, then you understand what I'm talking about? And I said, yes, I do. And we left. And after we got out in the hall, they said, what just happened? A guy named Jim Brown at Nebraska Educational Television, the staff artist, had created that very same symbol about 3 or 4 years before NBC paid up fortune to have somebody design it. And Nebraska, they sued. And they had to give them, I forget, X amount of dollars and a remote truck. And so that was what it was all about. That's the Nebraska influence.
I guess something that's been unique to being a comics historian is that it's a very welcoming profession, and that I've gotten to meet, in addition to heroes and local people, just had a wonderful experience interacting with comics creators and publishers. And it's just been incredibly rewarding and lucky to get to know people like Scott and Paul and have Bob visit the class where I get to teach his comics. I suppose something that's been very special that's come out of the fact that I was able to do something unique in comics research, which was collect all these comic books and comic book pamphlets that the U.S. Army and U.S. government and U.S. state agencies would all publish. And what that allowed me, because again, I was just this little kid on an army base in West Germany, where my dad just wanted me to get the hell off his back and just sort of gave me this army manual, was that I was invited by Redstone Armory in Alabama, where P.S. Monthly was situated, and I was asked to write basically P.S. Monthly's obituary when they closed the door on that long-standing and long-running educational comic book. And that was really bittersweet for me to kind of reflect on my introduction to the comics medium and reflect on the history of, again, just, it's something Bob had kind of alluded to, but these could be very dreary things, but the idea is that this government information is very important. It could literally save your life. And how Will Eisner and then people like Joe Kubert, and it goes on and on and on, of other comics artists who took on this government manual to make sure that regardless of your literacy rate, that if you were serving, that you were going to get the same amount of information. And that's just always interesting to me. And again, it was sort of bittersweet to be able to kind of reflect on that history and then write about that for the Comics Journal. and talk about the comic book, that kind of introduced me to this fabulous world that's allowed me so much opportunity. Because again, we live in such a visually rich world and rich culture that when I offer these classes, that students respond to them so strongly and so well that I feel very lucky to be able to have that at my disposal. So as a librarian, I often buy comics and graphic novels to support curriculum and reading interests at the university. And so with that opportunity, you come across all kinds of different stories that people are telling. People have really leveraged the graphic medium to tell memoir, to tell history, to be educational or instructional, to forego these two giants of DC and Marvel and tell their own superhero stories as well. It's just been incredibly rewarding, and I feel very lucky to be able to do that. Well, yeah, I'll just say that, historically, and until rather recently, comics have been kind of given a bad rap, right? I mean, there's always a social stigma attached to reading a comic book or a graphic novel, in that for the longest time it was either because you were illiterate or you were a juvenile delinquent. But right? And especially as an academic, if you were studying it, was even more problematic. But yeah, there's this question of whether when you read a comic, if you're authentically or legitimately doing some sort of reading or whatnot. But that bias is represented in terms of how archives and special collections collect whose papers they want. Right, and of course, when we think about Nebraska, we think of John Neihart, we think of Mary Sandoz, we think of Willa Cather, right? Literary, right? High art, fine art, but people like Bob, for example, for the idea of an archive, of a university archive, approaching Bob and saying that, as an alum, we recognize the value and worth and the impact that you've had in this field. We would love to have your papers to not only inspire our students, but that we see it as part of our mission to long-term preserve, your work. And that was rather controversial. And so most notably had been my strong interest in our university accumulating papers around S. Clay Wilson, because Wilson was a good friend of Ted Kuzer's, and was a connection of Kuzer and the sort of Illuminati or the literati of Lincoln, and visiting William Burroughs in Lawrence, Kansas, and keeping the Lawrence, Kansas, Lincoln, Nebraska pipeline up and alive and going. And so I had the fortune to meet with Wilson and talk to him and say, hey, that there's new librarians. We value the work that you've done. We recognize the comics medium as being high value, and we want to recognize the significance and impact of your work. We would love to have your papers. And unfortunately, he had suffered an accident that may have been because of a physical attack, or he may have fell. And unfortunately, the University of Nebraska has lost out on those papers. But a lot of his friends and colleagues, including Ted, have given us supplementary materials and supplementary drawings. Lincoln High School has an amazing archives and special collections, and that's quite notable. And so they have materials from Claire Briggs and Oz Black. Claire Briggs wrote an amazing, neat letter to Lincoln High School that they published in their yearbook, the one that Oz Black happened to design and illustrate. Bob attended Lincoln High. S. Clay Wilson attended Lincoln High. Would love to, collect and gather more of these sort of materials. Ohio State, Michigan State, Columbia University, Portland State, San Diego State. These are places that now actively, as centers of academia, collect these sort of things. And so hopefully Bob's materials will make their way for future generations to see, and among the names of other people like Mary Sandoz or Willa Cather, that we should be able to recognize people like Bob Hall and S. Clay Wilson as well.
I'll throw in two comments there. One is that the story at Lincoln High was that the art teacher had once told S. Clay Wilson, you could have something of a career, you have some talent as an artist, but not if you don't stop drawing motorcycle gangs fighting each other. Which became the whole...
Switched to pirates.
Yeah, yeah. I just overlapped him just slightly and knew him a little bit in college, and it was interesting guy. The other thing I had a thrill that one of the, now I make most of my living appearing at Comic Cons. At my age, I've become nostalgia. And so that's what I do.
You're a legend.
Yeah.
And going to Columbus, there's a GalaxyCon that always happens in Columbus, and that's the home of the Billy Ireland Comics Museum. It's probably the largest collection of comics going, and it's a lovely museum. And the guy who runs GalaxyCon had arranged for us to all go there, and so we went, and they had as if mainly for people who weren't quite sure what a comic museum would have. They had samples of various things out on the table, and for this one you could go to that room or that room. And I had a big thrill. One of the ones was a picture from a Tarzan that I had inked, and one of them was mine.
Nice.
And it was like, ooh, you know. and so I contributed a bunch of stuff to them after that. But the disappointing part about it is there is an equally fine collection somewhere in the archives of Sheldon.
yeah,
Thank
Dan
you.
Howard.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dan Howard's collection is there. As near as I can tell, it was exhibited when Dan contributed it, with a nice panel of great people that came, including Chris Ware, and I got to be on it. Bill Sienkiewicz, a magnificent artist, and Maggie Thompson, one of the great comic book writers and writing about comics.
Bob Harvey.
Bob Harvey
It's-
was there.
Yeah,
Will Eisner was supposed to be there, but he was ill,
right.
as I recall.
He passed
Yeah.
shortly after.
Yeah.
Now, years later, at that point, they asked me in the small Eisentrager Howard gallery at the university, they asked me to take some of that Dan Howard work, and we got together and created an exhibit. But that's been it for that. Whereas in Ohio, it's a constant presence. You can go at any time to this museum and see all this stuff. You can't here. You can see it online.
Yeah.
And I still wish there were some place where, because people would come if they just had that gallery on even a rotating exhibit in some room, someplace. So if any of you have any influence, we have the potential for that here, and it's just not being followed through. It's one of those things that I think the Sheldon just didn't know what to do with it. It didn't fit in their template. So, well, I think the only reason I could keep working in comics the first couple of years was that I was a good storyteller, and all of that came from the theater training. And being a director, there are a lot of people who can be cross-current. It's amazing how many people in the theater I'll run into who have done some, or in the comic book field, I mean, that have done some theater work. They are both visual mediums. They are both written mediums. Sometimes people will call comics primarily a visual medium, but by God, if that story isn't a well-written story that has a decent plot to it and decent characters, it still is. You can have the best art in the world, and you'll end up flipping through it to look at the art and never be aware of the story. So I think they've been very critical. One of the first things you find out when you've done a comic, you've spent maybe 3, 4, 5 days perfecting the stuff in your portfolio of each drawing. And all of a sudden you find out you have to produce 22 pages in 2.5 weeks of pencils. And that seems impossible. And it is when you first start. And I was sure I was going to get fired. And then when I was briefly an editor, I I found out that everybody who starts felt the same way of how do you ever accomplish this? And you figure out how to do it. It changes everything you've done, and you relearn to draw based on that. But it's very much like blocking a play. It's very much like scenery design. And certainly that I had a lot of scenery design training helped me a lot with backgrounds, perspective, those kind of things. So they really seemed to me that they were all integral. And some of my writing in the theater was, for instance, like an adaptation of Dracula. So I continued to do genre work in the theater. And to me, they all, over time, one of the great thrills was that Marvel was doing a Dracula comic. And the writer and the artist came to see our play, what's called The Passion of Dracula, that ran off Broadway for a couple of years. And they incorporated the play into the comic so that ostensibly the real Dracula saw a poster for it and decided to come, thought it was just dreadful, and wrecked the entire theater. So it was but that was a thrill. Boy, did I ever geek out when I saw that. I have a couple of friends, a woman named Megan Mackey, for one, who has done her own series. They are really good, and she's really, there's something called Apama by Tim, I can't remember the name, I'm sorry, but who's done his own comic, and he has created his own comic world, and they do very well. He has finally gotten to the point where he's making his living off of doing this, and she is too. Most people don't. Most people have to maintain some other work to keep that going, but if you can latch on, you will get a following. And the deal with these cons is I could do one if I wanted to every weekend of the year. I don't want to do that, but you could. There are that many out there. So that's a large audience when you come right down to it. That's a damn good audience.
SPX is good. Cake is one in Chicago. That's something very similar. If any of you are familiar with zines and Zine Fest, it's very similar in that everyone is tabling and you would walk out of there with a stack of stuff. As Bob said, some people dip in and dip out. Some people really hone their craft and go on and on. But yeah, SPX, that's really neat.
Yeah, Comic Cons are a whole nother thing. And the ones that are not devoted to publishing, but they will still be there. They're a major part of it. The vendors, Comic Cons have become a whole nother field for anybody involved in these businesses, and they divide into celebrities. People come to celebrities. They'll line up, and I never understand why they're willing to pay $40 to get an autograph of their picture with people that I've never heard of, but that's because I'm old and I don't follow all of this stuff. There are the creators, the quote creators, and that's us, the artists and writers who will come to these things to sell their wares, and in my case, I sell posters and do commissions for people. There are the cosplay people, some of whom have become professionals, but the most fun are the people that have created their own and come, and it's like community theater without having to learn any lines, and they make these amazing costumes. And then the vendors, and some of these are selling old comic books, but there are tons of people who are making their living or selling their wares or getting their books out there. A lot of them are awful. They are imitation genres. They're imitating other people who are imitating other people who are imitating other people. And some of them are bright, fresh, really professionally done, and that's their way of getting their work out. And there are at least two big Comic Cons in Nebraska that I know of. One is called OCon. It's really in Council Bluffs because that's where they can set it up, but it's you can go to that one and see this all happening. And the other one is it's called the Tri-City Con. It's I'm not sure what the third town is. It takes place in the Grand Island Fairbanks Fairgrounds, but it's I think also in Hastings, and I think they mean Kearney.
Kearney's the third.
Yeah.
That's the tri-state. That's where I grew up, so.
So and again, it's evolved into a very nice con, and you can go and experience all of this stuff in Nebraska now. So that's really cool too.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bob and Richard. This has been wonderful, and maybe they'll stick around to ask some questions in person for a little bit.
Oh, don't do that. Go to the gallery.